After more than 60 years of reigning as Lord of the Mountains, Cilicia and Armenia is no more. Prince Leo is dead, and his sons are blind, imprisoned, or on the run. There seemed to be no hope left for the Armenian inhabitants of Cilicia. Byzantium was overlord by right of reconquest. And just when all was lost, the Byzantine emperor lost one of his most prized prisoners. The second-born son of Leo and rightful prince of Cilicia slipped away from his captors. With nothing left to lose, this landless prince began his long journey home, intent on claiming his inheritance. The fate of the Armenian people rested in his hands alone. He would come to be known as Thoros the Great, the Lion of Cilicia. Upon escaping the cells of Constantinople, a disguised Thoros boarded a boat and made way into the eastern Mediterranean. To avoid Byzantine search patrols, he didn't take direct passage to Cilicia, instead going to the nearby island of Cyprus. Remaining incognito, Thoros waited for the next non-Byzantine ship to sail to the mainland. A Venetian trading galley took on the tall and mysterious stranger. They didn't care who he was, as long as his gold was true. It wasn't long before the capital of one of his father's greatest rivals came into view, Antioch. Still in enemy lands, Thoros made the long journey overland to the first of the Crusader states. By 1143, he arrived in Edessa. Ruled over by Thoros' cousin and supposed ally, Count Jocelyn II. In truth, the Count of Edessa needed an ally just as much as Thoros did, if not more. Just across the eastern border, the Seljuk splinter state of Mosul was gaining steam under its emblematic ruler, Zengi. He was committed to avenge the wrongdoings of the First Crusade, and acted as a unifying force for the Islamic peoples in the area. He directed his wrath at the most isolated of these Christian states, the county of Edessa. Before the invasion was fully underway, Thoros found a temporary ally, and more importantly, a spokesperson in his countly cousin. With his identity finally revealed, the Armenians started to flock around their downtrodden prince. The county of Edessa was already home to many Armenians, and even the headquarters of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Thoros gained a sizable force of Edessian and Cilician Armenians before the opportunity for his long-awaited return presented itself in the form of a pointed arrow in Cilicia. The Byzantine emperor, who had taken everything from Thoros, was in the midst of a campaign, on his way to Antioch and presumably Edessa from there. Before delving into the Alexandrian plain, Emperor John II Komnenos heard of the ferocity and size of the wild boar located in the mountains of his newly conquered Cilician land. While Prince Leo could not kill the Byzantine emperor, a hunting trip in Cilicia would. The thing about hunting wild boar without modern weapons is that they are pure, adrenaline-filled, murdering machines, as seen on Game of Thrones. An arrow, without a direct shot in the eye, will not kill a boar. But a poisoned arrow, that's a different story. Emperor John accidentally stabbed himself with his own poisoned arrow. Probably one of the biggest, oh shit, moments in history. He died a few days later. The campaign was suspended and the army returned to Constantinople. Thoros the Lion pounced on Cilicia. As he crossed the Taurus Mountains, the countryside erupted in support of their returned prince. He made way to his family's ancestral mountaintop stronghold, the stormy castle of Vaca. The Byzantines only left a small garrison, in comparison to the reawakened Armenian mob prepared to storm the gates. It wasn't long before Thoros stood overlooking the Taurus Mountains, on the walls of Vaca, Against all odds, Thoros had done it. He was the Lord of the Mountain. But he stood alone, not another Rubenid family member in sight. Thoros' two brothers who weren't dead or blind arrived at Vaca shortly after the fort's recapture. Stefan and Mele had been on the run in the northern Taurus Mountains for more than 6 years. During that time, the two youngest became adept militarily, defending their homeland to the best of their abilities in the absence of their older brother. Stefan and Mele's circumstances filled them both with anger, and Stefan chose to focus all his frustration into revenge against the Byzantines, leaving him as a man perfectly fit to lead the armies of Cilicia as its marshal. While Stefan and Thoros could both focus their anger onto their conquerors, the case was not the same for the youngest of the rowdy Rubenid bunch. Mele was undoubtedly a great leader of men in battle, but his ferocity didn't end on the battlefield. He was prone to outbursts and wasn't afraid to question his prince and marshal brothers. He was a loose cannon, but for now, the task of retaking Cilicia was enough to preoccupy his festering ambition. With his brothers now beside him, Thoros the Great followed in the footsteps of Lord Ruben himself, conquering interior Cilicia one mountaintop at a time. But just as Thoros had reclaimed his family castle, his cousin, Jocelyn II of Edessa, had just lost his. The Edessan Count decided to preemptively strike at Zengi, but this left the gates of Edessa wide open and without an army to defend it. The three bishops who resided in Edessa attempted to lead a siege, but could not muster enough men to line the walls. Edessa fell on Christmas Day of 1144. With the first of the Crusader states eliminated, Cilicia, Armenia's only ally, was gone. Jocelyn II tried and succeeded in recapturing Edessa after Zengi was assassinated. He held on to it for a short time before Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, retook the battleground of a city. Shortly after this, Count Jocelyn was captured, blinded, and would follow a fate not so dissimilar from Thoros's a few years ago. He would spend the rest of his life in the dungeons of Aleppo. With Nur ad-Din's strength continuing to grow, Thoros wasted no time retaking Cilicia. By 1147, his borders stretched from the lands of the dastardly and Armenian Lampron nobility to the Principality of Antioch in the east. The task of reconquering the mountainous interior of Cilicia had been completed in a matter of only 3 years. When Western Europe learned about the fall of Edessa, many knights and nobles raised their banners to start the Second Crusade. Not only did the lowly warrior class attend this crusade, but for the first time, their kings joined them. The kings of both France and Germany were to lead their respective armies into the Holy Land. A religious war taken up by fourth-born sons of minor nobles was proven so glorious and so enriching that Europe's most powerful kings wanted their own slice. While the First Crusade presented a lifeline to the Armenians of Cilicia, the sequel did little if anything positive for Thoros. The Crusader kings both went around Cilicia. One thing the Crusaders did do while passing by Cilicia was purchase food and supplies from the Armenians, somewhat reviving the once lucrative commerce with the Westerners. After passing Cilicia, both crusading armies were defeated. Help was not coming for Thoros in the form of European knights. He would have to fight his own battle to reclaim the coastal plains. In 1148, Thoros the Great recaptured the gem of Cilicia and the capital of his father, the bustling city of Sis and its twin peaks. the prince had truly returned to his city as a liberator. After this, the 4 years of impressively quick conquest were heavily slowed down, but Thoros was only pausing to prepare himself and his army for their most challenging mission yet: the reconquest of the Cilician plains. The Lion of Cilicia again waited for his Byzantine prey to shoot itself in the foot with a poisoned arrow. While that level of miracle didn't happen twice, a small window of opportunity did open. Thoros' two most powerful rivals, Emperor Emmanuel and Nur ad-Din, were in the midst of a war that they were both bleeding heavily from. In 1151, Thoros crossed the Cilician gates with an army, intent on retaking the coast. The first obstacle in the Armenians' way was the city of Mamistra, one of the 3 major cities that rested on the Cilician plain. Mamistra was home to the unreactive Byzantine governor of Cilicia, a man named Thomas. Although he allowed Thoros to take forts at his own will, Thomas was finally awakened to action upon seeing the lion banners. The governor sallied out of Mamistra, army in tow. Thoros, not dismayed, prepared his army for battle. It only lasted a few moments before the Prince of Cilicia slew Thomas the governor. With him gone, all of the Cilician plain was left open to Thoros. Finally, with the Rubenid reconquest nearly complete, the Byzantines decided to act against their escaped prisoner. Emperor Emmanuel sent his cousin, Andronicus Komnenos. A future emperor in his own right, Andronicus began his march from Constantinople with 12,000 soldiers, mostly cavalry, behind him. By 1152, Komnenos arrived in a war-ridden Cilicia. Thoros had remained inactive behind the walls of his newly captured city, reconsolidating his reign. Andronicus marched to Mamistra, expecting his outnumbered Armenian foe to hide behind his walls. And he did, until Thoros was angered. Once in earshot, Andronicus Komnenos rode to the front of his army. Gesturing toward Thoros, he yelled out, "Behold, your father's iron chains. I will take you bound in them to Constantinople, just like your father." Now, seething with anger, Thoros and his brothers plotted their revenge. A storm was brewing in both Mamistra and on the horizon. One rainy night, when the time was right, the gates were opened. In only a few moments, 7,500 Armenians bursted out of Mamistra. Hurriedly getting into position, Thoros ordered for a charge. His brothers on either flank, Thoros led from the center, crashing into the Byzantine cavalry that barely had any time to get into position. That night, the Armenian infantry won a slugfest in the rain. Andronicus retreated to Antioch almost immediately, leaving his army to face the Cilician prince alone. Soon, they surrendered, and Thoros chose to grant mercy, ransoming the Byzantine soldiers soon after. Thoros' army were not the only Armenians present on the battlefield that night. The Byzantines' most powerful vassal in the region, Ocean II, Lord of Lampron Castle, was also ransomed out of captivity. But his son and future ruler of Lampron was taken as a hostage by Thoros. To finally quell the half-century of Rubenid-Lampronid quarreling, Thoros showed mercy yet again. But only because it benefited him and all the Armenian people. Thoros' daughter would marry Hetum, the heir of Lampron, thereby connecting the only 2 Armenian-ruled states in the world by blood. For his part of the dowry, Thoros gave half of Ocean's ransom back to him. With Byzantium defeated and the Lampronids forcefully befriended, Thoros grabbed the other 2 major cities on the Cilician coast, Adana, and Tarsus, the latter of which sat but a few short miles from Lampron Castle. Thoros appeared unstoppable, surrounded by enemies on all sides. Diplomacy wasn't even a viable option at this point, past Lampron, leaving every single direction an avenue for conquest, or a road to quick riches. Thoros invaded the Rum Sultanate that next year, but he was not here to conquer, he only came to raid. The Cilician pirate returned enriched before the Turks could stop him. He, however, would pay for this in the next year, when the Sultan of Rum, Masud I, invaded Cilicia. By this point in 1154, Thoros was preparing for his next conquest on the far western coast of the Principality. Despite his absence, the countryside of northern Cilicia managed to evacuate before Sultan Masud arrived. He marched unopposed to the fortress of Anazarbis, which guarded the capital city of Sis. He began besieging the impressive fortress, so confident was he that he even sent a few contingents south to raid into the nearby Principality of Antioch. Shortly after crossing through the Cilician gates, the Rum army was ambushed by a regiment of Knights Templar. After a charge, the Rum expeditionary force broke, running back to their sultan. When the remnants of the Rum force returned to Anazarbis, they saw that Masud had not yet broken through the walls. The siege was not going well, and the bloodied men from Antioch only served to demoralize his army even more. Soon enough, the Sultan gave up his siege and returned to Rum lands. Thoros didn't even have time to get back before he was already gone. The Armenians had just defeated an invasion, without much loss and without a single battle. Emperor Emmanuel was getting desperate for someone to put down the Cilician lion. What he found was a man only after two things: gold and war. Reynold of Chatillon. Widely regarded as one of the greediest and martially prowess of the Crusaders, which, might I remind you, is a cast of characters known for their capitalistic brand of militant Christianity. A few years previous, Reynold had married the Princess of Antioch, and therefore became the ruling Prince of Antioch. Emperor Emmanuel promised to recognize the new Prince of Antioch if he fought Thoros on behalf of Byzantium. More important to Reynold was the Byzantine gold promised to him if he defeated Thoros. In 1155, Thoros captured the land around the Gulf of Alexandretta, a district where the princes of Antioch once ruled, leaving a viable justification for war. Reynold and his army promptly marched into Alexandretta. They only made it a few days into their campaign before Thoros and his Armenians were in view and prepared for a fight. Once allies long ago, the Crusaders smashed into the Armenian infantry. The Western heavy cavalry got the better of Thoros that day. A few minutes into the battle, the Cilician prince called for a retreat. With Thoros forced back into the mountains, Prince Reynold seized Alexandretta, but he didn't reoccupy the territory, as you may suspect. Instead, he handed the land over to the protection of the Knights Templar. And as a sign of goodwill with their fellow Christians, the monastic order agreed to assist both Antioch and the Armenians if they were ever desperate for help. With Alexandretta in Crusader hands, Reynold ended his mercenary war. He sent word to Emperor Emmanuel, ready to collect his due. But Emmanuel had other ideas. He felt that he had not yet earned his pay, having not taken the land for himself but giving it to an Armenian ally. Little did Emmanuel know what kind of man Reynold of Chatillon was. He would get his money, one way or another. Thoros, now defeated for the first time, was still on high security from the Antiochian invasion when he received a letter from his most recent enemy, What it contained would completely reverse both Thoros and Reynald's fortunes. The Prince of Antioch offered a hand in alliance to the Armenians of Cilicia. It had been decades since these two principalities were allies, and now that they were finally united, these princes set their sights high. They assembled and combined their army and navy, prepared to hit the Byzantines where they least expected it. A place where Thoros had stopped on his way back to Cilicia, the island of Cyprus. Just like the Cilician pirates of antiquity, Thoros and Reynald made landfall and began looting everything in their path. What followed was a systematic plundering of nearly the entire island. The princes stayed for a grand total of 3 weeks, taking what Eastern Rome had owed them both. Thoros and Reynald became close friends after this piratical attack. Finally, with an ally, the Armenian prince was not living in a completely hostile world. But to the north, the Marshal of Cilicia, and brother of Thoros, Stefan, was conducting a military campaign without permission. Thoros had the fortune to have 2 warmongering younger brothers, which was a great thing in the highly usual times of war, but a terrible thing during peace. Marshal Stefan was occupying forts across the border in the Rum Sultanate. While this unauthorized act of war was highly frowned upon by both parties, it would simultaneously bring them together. In 1158, much to the anger of Stefan, Rum Sultan, Kilija Arslan II, and Prince Thoros entered into an alliance. Although he had reforged Cilician Armenia by the sword, Thoros knew all too well the consequences of war. Where enemies once surrounded Cilicia, now the Armenians befriended Christian and Muslim alike. In that same year, the traditional enemy of the Rubinids tried again to defeat Thoros the Great. Last time, the Armenians had bested the Byzantines by means of a surprise attack. Emperor Emmanuel would play by these same rules, as he surprise attacked Cilicia. Prince Thoros was completely caught unaware in the nearby city of Tarsus. With his army scattered, the Cilician prince had only moments to evacuate his family and head for the hills. With Thoros in hiding, the emperor reclaimed the Cilician coast over the course of the next 2 years, including the capital city of Sis. The decision not to fight the Byzantine Empire's main army might seem confusing, but you have to remember how easy it is to take the Cilician plains, opposed to the Taurus Mountains, that is. It might as well have been 2 different states. Instead of risking both, Thoros decided to play the long game. No matter how hard he tried, Emperor Emmanuel could not retake the mountains of Cilicia. With both rulers unyielding in their war, the King of Jerusalem stepped in to put an end to this stalemate. Thoros, always a proudly independent man, once his escape from Constantinople, was to do something that would put him in direct threat of arrest. The prince walked barefoot, alone, and without his crown, to the Byzantine camp. Here he prostrated himself in front of Emperor Emmanuel, who accepted his submission and allowed Thoros to own the lands he still held. While this war was just another episode in the Armenian-Byzantine rivalry, the end of this war would actually result in a diplomatic spin into friendly relations. While Thoros and Emmanuel were ready to bury the hatchet, not every Armenian, or Rubinid for that matter, was. Marshal Stefan, as he had done previously, started a campaign without permission from his prince and brother. He decided to continue the war that Thoros was so willing to end. He started retaking the Cilician plain that Thoros could not reclaim on his own. Eventually, he was invited to discuss certain plans with the Byzantine governor, discussions he thought would lead him to the throne of Cilicia. He was seized upon arrival, just like his father. Having broke the peace treaty, the Byzantines wasted no time in executing their most recent Rubenid captive. Not only this, but they mutilated his corpse beyond recognition and threw his body over the walls of Tarsus, leaving it there to rot. Although Thoros was angered with his brother for disobeying him on repeated occasions, he was even more angered by the Byzantines who had already taken one brother from him. Upon hearing of Marshal Stephen's death, Thoros the Great began simultaneous sieges of Cilicia's coastal cities. By this point, Emperor Emmanuel was tired of war with the Armenians. After all, his governor disobeyed Byzantium just as much as Stephen had disobeyed Thoros. A peace settlement was finally reached when Manuel agreed to replace his governor in Cilicia with a certain Constantius Kalamanos, and he also gave Thoros a small portion of land near Sis. A year later in 1164, Thoros received a plea for help from his Antiochian ally. It was not Prince Reynaud. He had been captured a few years ago while on campaign against Nur ad-Din, the Emir of Aleppo. Now the son of Zangi was conducting his own attack on Antioch. Not only did Prince Bohemond III of Antioch call for aid from Thoros, but also Tripoli and the new Byzantine governor of Cilicia. Once this motley coalition arrived in Antioch, Nur ad-Din quickly began a withdrawal of his army. Wanting to finally put an end to the threat from Aleppo, while his friends still surrounded him, Prince Bohemond ordered for a chasing of the Muslim army. Once Nur ad-Din was within sight, the excited Bohemond was eager to call for a charge. All agreed, besides the two experienced Rubenids, Thoros and Mele. Despite their warnings, the coalition overruled them and began their pursuit. The emir retreated before feigning his flight and turning to attack the surprised Christians. The coalition army was pushed into a swamp and massacred, all leaders being taken captive. All besides the cautious Thoros and his only remaining brother. Nur ad-Din ceased his invasion with this victory, crippling most of his neighbors to inaction. 2 years later in 1166, Thoros would visit the holy city of Jerusalem. The Armenians were already a large portion of the city's population, having their own quarter of the city that they called home. Thoros offered the king of Jerusalem a sizable number of Armenians that could no longer fit in his shrunken principality. The king agreed, on the condition that these new migrants had to pay a yearly tax that all non-Catholics were made to pay. Thoros denied his proposal, but still enjoyed his small vacation to the center of the Crusader cause. When Thoros returned to Cilicia, he was greeted by a warm embrace from his brother Mele, at least the Armenian version of a welcome back home. The younger and much angrier Rubenid plotted to kill his brother while they were on a hunting trip. But his plot had been discovered and revealed to the Prince of Cilicia. Despite this, Thoros agreed to go on the hunt with his treacherous brother. Once sufficiently alone, just before Mele made his move, Thoros suddenly tackled his brother and held him firmly to the ground. He told him of his own plans, and Mele did not refuse. With this being his final brother, Thoros couldn't bear to execute him. He was henceforth exiled from Cilicia, with nothing but the clothes on his back. Ambition and anger still festered in Mele. He was willing to do just about anything to gain power in Cilicia. He even converted to Islam. This he only did to gain the favor of Emir Nur ad-Din, a man whose military expertise had been personally witnessed by Mele. The Zengid took the Rubenid under his wing, and gave him the governorship of a province bordering Armenian Cilicia. Not even a year after his brother's betrayal, Thoros had yet another problem to contend with. This was a situation he was more than accustomed to, and tired of at this point. In 1168, Emperor Emmanuel started another, unprovoked war with Cilicia. The Byzantine invasion was marked by the same problem as the previous one. The mountains were just too tall for the Romans to besiege. After the initial push proved a failure, the Byzantines raided for a time before calling off their war. By this point in 1169, Thoros the Great had spent a lifetime marked by endless and ferocious warfare that destroyed his family and clouded his head with darkness. He had revived Armenian Cilicia, but ever since then, it had been an uphill battle to keep his homeland. Weary of war and tired of politics, Prince Thoros II abdicated his throne in favor of his son, a 4-year-old boy named Reuben. After his retirement, Thoros retreated to a monastery and became a monk, hoping never again to see the ravages of war. Some sources state that he died only a few months later, finally resting in his exhausted state. Other sources leave his death as a mystery. Perhaps he lived to see the fall of his young son, and the return of his malicious brother. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And join Derek Clark, Savak Leo Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nickmate Voician, Lazarus Dykos, and Dave J. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent, and what? Why? Thank you guys again for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it.